I want to remind everyone that this is being recorded. I want to also remind people that these are sponsored by Cape Cod 5, First Citizens Federal Credit Union, and Martha's Vineyard Savings. And we also want people to know that all the books that are part of this series can be bought at Eight Cousins Bookseller in Falmouth. So wanted to let people know about that. I also hope that everybody was able to navigate Eventbrite okay. As I told Dr. Norton that she's a little bit of a lab rat, that we haven't done these Eventbrite things before, so I hope that worked out okay. If you had some issues with it, let me know, and I'll try to make sure I get them fixed for the next one. Our speaker tonight is coming to us. Even though she's a professor at Cornell, she's actually doing this from the Vineyard, which is one of the reasons she's doing this topic tonight. Mary Beth Norton is an American historian. She specializes in American colonial history, well known for her work on women's history, Salem witch trials. She went to Harvard. She went to University of Michigan, and I said, do you want me to say University of Michigan or Tom Brady's school? She said, is it perfectly okay to say it was Tom Brady's school? So we'll play that silly little game. She went to Tom Brady's school, and she also has a new book that came out in February called 1774: The Long Year of Revolution. And part of her talk tonight, because she's coming from the Vineyard, is a little bit of a spin-off of that. Would you say, Dr. Norton?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a subset of that as to what was going on in the Cape during the famous Boston Tea Party. So when we get done tonight, we want to make sure that you go out and buy her book, 1774, The Long Year of Revolution. Is here we are in 2020, the long year of COVID. So without further ado, would you welcome Mary Beth Norton?
Thanks, Mark. Can you set this up so that I'm seeing mostly myself on the screen instead of seeing mostly you? Not that I don't like seeing you, but just it's easier if I'm looking at myself.
If you change it to gallery view instead of speaker, or
yes, I changed it to
gallery view. I'm seeing you, so it's so go up in your upper right corner to gallery view. I think. So
I did, and I'm now seeing everybody.
Okay, then go to speaker view.
That's what I did. Okay. That shows you.
Well, as soon as you start talking, it'll show you.
Well, it isn't. I'm talking and it's not showing me. It's showing somebody else.
All right. Well, how about you start talking and we'll see you.
Okay. All right. But I actually want to show you the cover of the book so you'll know what to look for at Eight Cousins Bookstore. This is it. I'm hoping that you can see it on a large screen, not just a tiny thumbnail screen. 1774, The Long Year of Revolution. Some of you may be familiar with this little device in the middle of the cover. That's a bottle that is at the Massachusetts Historical Society, and it is filled with tea that is said to be tea that was picked up at the on Dorchester, on the shore in Dorchester, the day after the Boston Tea Party. So that book, which I'm going to talk about today, or I'm going to draw on it, narrates in detail the events of what I call the long 1774, which is the period from December 1773, with a small preface in October, which I will explain shortly, to mid-April 1775, to show how colonists who all saw themselves as loyal subjects of King George III and part of the empire in 1773, divided into groups during the year 1774. One of those groups persisted in their loyalty to King George, and indeed they began to call themselves loyalists, which is a term that was invented in that year. And there's a second group that began to favor independence in the year 1774. And this is why I think 1774 is so important that it deserves a book all to itself. I deal with all the colonies that eventually joined the United States, although books on this period, when they exist, which isn't often, focus primarily on Massachusetts. So I sort of apologize in advance to everybody about that, but I'm only going to be talking about Massachusetts and the Cape tonight. The book also focuses intensively on America, because most books in this period change their focus at some point and flip across the Atlantic and talk about what's going on in Parliament. I wanted to focus on what Americans knew about what was going on. So I don't do that. I have what I call advices from London in every chapter. And that is basically a section of reports from London that were written, either their newspapers or their letters or whatever, that come to the colonies, so that that's what the Americans knew, and only what the Americans knew, not any kind of details about debates in Parliament. Now, rather than try to summarize all or even most of my book, in the short time I have today, I'm going to focus in detail on just one of the incidents I described, the series of incidents of events that are covered in the first chapter that occurred on Cape Cod, because I thought this little known tale would be of particular interest to all of you. I should say that I unearthed this story from a variety of sources, from correspondence and documents in Boston at the Mass Historical Society and at the Boston Athenaeum, in London, and in San Marino, California at the Huntington Library, because some of the papers ended up there, and also from newspapers. Now, you know, I'm speaking virtually from the Vineyard today, but in the course of researching this talk and this story, I visited the Cape locations that I'm going to talk about. That is Eastham, Wellfleet, Provincetown, and the site of the shipwreck that's really my subject tonight, and that is the Peaked Hill sandbars, which is now, of course, as you probably all know, in the Cape Cod National Seashore. And I was aided in that visit by some wonderful workers, wonderful rangers from the Cape Cod National Seashore, from the National Park Service. Now, I'd like to begin tonight by quoting directly from the first page of the first chapter of the book, because I start the book with the wreck that I'm going to talk about tonight. Quote, during the stormy early morning hours of December 11th, 1773, a vessel carrying tea and other cargo to Boston wrecked about 2 miles southeast of Race Point. On board the William were 58 chests of East India Company tea, 55 of which were successfully salvaged. The 3 damaged chests, each containing about 350 pounds of bohea, or black tea, remained on the Cape when the other chests were transported later in the month to the safety of the British headquarters at Castle William, an island in Boston Harbor. Responding to the sudden arrival of approximately 1,000 pounds of tea on their shores, Cape residents worked to earn it, bought and sold it, argued and fought over it, and destroyed some of it. So that's in brief what I'm going to be, that's a kind of a preview of what I'll be talking about tonight in detail. So I do want to tell you the story of that tea on the Cape, but first I need to explain why it was there in the first place and why it was so controversial that it caused trouble throughout pretty much the rest, or at least the first months of 1774. Now, the tea story that everybody knows is the story of the Boston Tea Party. I might say that it was not called that until 1826. That was discovered by my colleague at Cornell, Larry Glickman. I did not find that, he did. But more studies than Boston were involved in the tea story. The East India Company actually sent 7 tea ships to North America in 1773. 4 were dispatched to Boston, and 1 each was sent to New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston. Now, I have to give you a brief background. The Tea Act was adopted by Parliament in the spring of 1773. Its purpose was to save the East India Company from bankruptcy. The East India Company was being badly mismanaged. It was a monopoly, so it shouldn't surprise us to learn that it was badly mismanaged. It held the legal monopoly of all trade with Great Britain and what was known then as the Indies, that is basically China and what is now Indonesia. But what's at issue here is tea from China. the East India Company was badly mismanaged, but it also had another major problem. It was confronted by rampant smuggling of all items that people were only supposed to buy legally from the East India Company. Excuse me. And in particular, there were textiles and tea were the most avidly desired items that came from China to Great Britain and its colonies. Now, the American colonists at the time were known as, quote, prodigious tea drinkers. That's a word I picked up from the contemporary sources. It will not surprise you to learn that many members of Parliament were stockholders of the East India Company. So they wanted to prevent the East India Company from going bankrupt. The American colonies, in their prodigious tea drinking, mostly did not drink East India Company tea. I'll call it EICT, which is shorter. Did not mostly drink EICT. They drank WOCT, which is WOCT, which is the Dutch India Company, the Dutch East India Company. And it was smuggled, and it was mostly smuggled through the Dutch Caribbean islands, especially the small island in the northeastern Caribbean known as St. Eustatius at the time. Today it's known as Statia. I suspect no one on this call have ever been there. I've actually gone there twice, specifically because I knew it was such an important smuggling haven in the 18th century. It's not out of the way. It's very well located, and that's why it was such a good place for tea smugglers. But it was, however, or it is not a very good resort island. It doesn't have a white sandy beach. It doesn't have a lot of water. And so it cannot ever have a resort, a Caribbean resort kind of society. Now, the Tea Act was very complex, and it's hard to understand. And in fact, people at the time had trouble understanding it, which is not surprising. But what's important for us is that the key aim of the Tea Act was to lower the tax on legal East India Company tea in the colonies in order to undercut the smugglers, because the smugglers, unsurprisingly, were selling their tea for half or 2/3 the cost of East India Company tea, which was legal and taxed. And so the idea of the Tea Act was to lower the tax that Americans were paying so that they would be more likely to buy East India Company tea. Now, the Americans' key objection was to the symbolism of the tax. They did not want to accept the authority of Parliament to tax them. Pretty much all Americans believed in what we now know as the slogan, no taxation without representation. That did not mean that Americans wanted representation in Parliament, which is the way it's often interpreted. No, rather what it meant was what Americans wanted was only to be taxed by their own colonial legislatures, people for whom they had already voted. Now, I want you to note the irony in this in terms of our current understanding and interpretation of the Boston Tea Party. Everybody today thinks that the Boston Tea Party was a protest against higher taxes. No, it was a protest against lower taxes. It was a protest against lower taxes because that was the idea behind the Tea Act, was to lower the tax. Now, so I said that there would be a preface to this talk, and that's in October, when the colonists first learned that tea ships were coming under the terms of the Tea Act. Remember, it was passed in May, but it took a while for the East India Company to get itself organized and to send tea over. And so in October, the colonists learned that there were tea ships coming. When they learned this, men in Philadelphia and New York wrote essays in the newspapers challenging the East India Company. And they wrote 3 suggestions as to how Americans could resist the East India Company's tea. One man in Philadelphia suggested persuading, and I put that in air quotes because what he meant was coercing the merchants to whom the tea was being sent, who were known as consignees. They were going to receive all the East India Company tea coming and then would distribute it elsewhere, to persuade those men to resign their commissions as consignees. And the argument that he made was, if the tea consignees all resigned their positions, then no tea could be sold, and so nobody needed to worry. So that was one argument, get the consignees to resign. A second argument was put forward by a New Yorker, and he said, no, let's not do that. Let's all just sign agreements not to buy or consume East India Company tea. We'll have a general boycott agreement. So that was his argument. But then there was a third argument, also by a Philadelphian, in this case by a man whose name you may know, Benjamin Rush, who was eventually a leader of the revolution in Pennsylvania. He was a doctor, a young doctor at this time, and he argued for preventing the tea from landing in the first place. Now, all three of these tactics were tried in 1773 and thereafter in various locations, because what is not generally known is that East India Company tea kept coming to the colonies throughout 1774. Later on, the tea was not directly sent by the East India Company. It was ordered by individual merchants, but it was nevertheless sent to the colonies. And so the colonies had throughout the year to think of what their responses to the East India Company tea was going to be. Okay, so the response we all know about is the Boston Tea Party, when the landing of the tea was opposed by its destruction from the 3 ships that made it into the harbor. And that was because there were large meetings in Boston that all agreed that that's what should happen, that they should destroy the tea, or at least that they shouldn't complain about the destruction of the tea, at the very least. And again, this is ironic because Boston had lagged in its opposition to the tea. Remember, those arguments were coming out of New York and Philadelphia. They were not coming out of Boston. Boston was a latecomer to the opposition to the tea. That's not the way we think of Boston today. Now, Parliament retaliated against Boston with the Boston Port Act, which closed the port of Boston on June 1st, until the tea was paid for. And if people want to ask me questions about that later, I'll be happy to answer it. I'll just say that Boston didn't even find out about that law until the middle of May. So they had all of about 2 weeks to get ready for a complete closure of their port. But the real issue that I want to talk about today is what happened to those other tea ships, including the one that wrecked on the Cape. Now, it's not widely known. In fact, I didn't know it. I taught the American Revolution for 40 years, but never knew that Charleston was dealing with its tea ship at exactly the same time that Boston was dealing with its 3 tea ships. Now, in chapter 1 of my book, I tell the stories of Boston and Charleston together, interweaving them chronologically. We go from 1 week in Boston to 1 week in Charleston and back and forth. The cities did not know what was going on in the other city because there was too much, it just took too long for the information to get back and forth, even by sea. By the end of the process, I'm going to talk about briefly, Boston and Charleston each knew that the other tea ship had arrived, but they didn't know very much about what was happening. That is, Charleston didn't know that Boston had destroyed the tea, and Boston didn't know what Charleston was doing. So Charleston, in fact, did something very different from what Boston did. Charleston had two large meetings, just as Boston did. It had large meetings of residents, but the residents could not decide what to do. Unlike Boston, where people pretty much were agreed, in Charleston, they could not make up their minds what to do. That's why they needed 2 big meetings. And then, even after the meetings, they couldn't decide what the meetings had decided. There's confusion everywhere in the newspapers and in the correspondence that I looked at and so forth. So what happened in Charleston was that the Carolinians facilitated the confiscation of the tea by customs officers for non-payment of the tea duty. And here I need to say something about what the law said. The customs law in Britain at the time said that when a ship entered a harbor with a cargo, the duty had to be paid on that cargo within 20 days or the cargo would be confiscated. So in this case, that's actually why the Boston Tea Party occurred the night it did, on the 16th of December, because the next day was the 17th of December, the 20th day after the ship had entered the harbor, the first ship had entered the harbor. And so the customs officers would have moved, Boston customs officers would have moved to confiscate the tea the next day. Well, in Charleston, that came a couple of days later. And in this case, the people in Charleston just stood around and watched while the customs officers took took 300 chests of tea out of the cargo hold of the ship London, which was the ship in Charleston, and stored it all in the basement of the Exchange Building, which was a big mercantile building on the harbor in Charleston. And it's still there. You can visit it and you can see the cellar where this tea was stored after it was confiscated by the customs officers. So then what about Philadelphia and New York? That's Charleston. So Philadelphia actually knew what had happened in Boston by the time the tea ship arrived in Philadelphia. It had to sail up the Delaware to get to Philadelphia. And it was a little bit delayed after the ships that came to Charleston and Boston. And by the time it arrived, the day before, fortuitously, Paul Revere had ridden into town carrying the message from Boston about what had happened. Well, the people in Philadelphia did not want to get into the trouble that the people in Boston got into. So they decided that the best thing to do was to prevent the ship from entering the harbor. Therefore, the 20-day deadline would never apply. So that's what they did. They intercepted the ships in Philadelphia, and they persuaded the captain not to enter the harbor. The report in the newspaper just sort of, they talked to him and they convinced him not to enter the harbor. I don't know how they Delaware, and he sailed back to England. The New York ship was a different story again, because the New York ship was blown off course, far off course, by the very same North Atlantic gale that wrecked the ship on Cape Cod. It was blown all the way to Antigua, and it spent the winter in Antigua, the winter of 1773-74. Of course, that ship captain knew exactly what had happened because he got the news when it happened in Charleston, Philadelphia, and Boston. He didn't want anything to do with any of it. So he rode ahead to New York and he said, okay, because of my contract, I have to come to New York, but I'm not going to try to enter the harbor. I'm just going to resupply the ship and I'm going to go right back to London. So that's what he did. He did not arrive until the end of April, but everyone welcomed him broadly. They knew he was not going to do anything. They knew he was not going to try to enter the harbor. They knew they were not going to try to land the tea. And they helped him resupply the ship. And there's this wonderful thing in newspapers in New York about how all the leaders of the opposition to the tea in New York stood on the wharf at Perth Amboy, New Jersey, which is where he was, waving him goodbye and wishing him a good voyage back to London. Now, the seventh ship is my real topic tonight, and that's the one that wrecked on the Cape. Now, the news of the wreck arrived in Boston on 16th December, the very day the tea on the ships in the harbor was destroyed. The fate of the tea from the William, I think, supplies persuasive evidence that colonial anti-tea organizers chose well when they decided to try to prevent the EIC tea from being brought on shore and marketed to colonial customers. It allows historians to consider a short hypothetical question that's usually unanswerable. How would colonists have responded if the East India Company's tea had actually been landed and offered for sale in 1773 and 1774? I argue that what happened on the Cape when the tea arrived could well have been replicated in many other American locales had resistance not succeeded as well as it did. So what happened? Let me tell you the story about what happened on the Cape in 1773. 1774. Well, the leaders of Boston assumed that people on the Cape would destroy the tea, but that's not what happened. The first official on the scene was a man named Greeno, who was Barnstable County Justice of the Peace based in Wellfleet. And he, a merchant, had business dealings with Richard Clark and Sons, who were the owners of the ship William. Greeno was also a personal friend of Jonathan Clark, who was one of the sons of the firm. Soon, in the absence of the owners, Greeno supervised the unloading of the cargo by the crew and local workers from the wrecked ship. Greeno supervised them. He hired them, and they carted the salvaged items to Provincetown. They must have used ox carts. There's no other way they could have done it. It must have been a really difficult job going through those sand dunes on the Cape, away from the Peaked Hill bars, going and taking the items to Provincetown, which included, by the way, things other than tea. It included street lamps for the city of Boston that Boston was looking for, and medicines and other items that Boston was waiting to get. Now, some of the contents had been damaged, as I already said. 4 of the 58 tea chests were damaged, although one of those 4 was reloaded into a barrel. So basically, there were 55 tea chests that were salvaged from the wreck and in good enough shape to send up to Boston. He used the tea, that is Greeno, used the tea in one of the other 3 damaged chests of Bohea to pay the workers he had hired. Now, I have no idea how many workers he hired. I have no idea how much tea was left in that damaged chest, but there could have been as much as 300 pounds or 250 pounds of tea in that chest, depending on how many workers there were. Some workers could have been paid with a lot of tea, so we just don't know. Now, Jonathan Clark then arrived. Clark rode practically nonstop the 119 miles to Provincetown from Boston as quickly as he could. He and Greeno arranged to have the cargo from the ship that was not tea sent up to Boston in local ships from Provincetown. But they found it really hard to find a vessel that would take the tea. There was a captain of a Salem fishing vessel that had sheltered from the storm in Provincetown Harbor, and he agreed to take the 54 chests and 1 barrel of EICT up to Castle William. This guy, who was from Salem, as I say, he was a fisherman. After he returned to Salem, he was called before the Salem town meeting, and he was asked to explain why he had hired his ship to Clark and Greeno. He defended himself that he did it, quote, through mere inadvertence, quote, and ignorance, end quote. So he said, I knew nothing. I didn't know what I was doing. It was an inadvertent violation of whatever rules you guys are trying to impose. It was nothing to me. I just did this ignorantly. He also defended the owner of the ship, because the owner of the ship was accused of having sent the ship directly to Provincetown to pick up the tea. And he said, no, that didn't happen. It was pure happenstance that the ship was there, and the owner knew nothing about it. Nevertheless, there were people in Salem, men, who disguised themselves as Indians and went to attack, to do some kind of attack on the owner of the ship. They, however, discovered to their dismay that the owner of the ship was then being inoculated against smallpox in the local smallpox hospital. And therefore, they could have gotten infected with smallpox, because inoculation is not vaccination. To be inoculated, you had to be infested with a little bit of the live smallpox virus. So anybody who went into the smallpox hospital could have gotten infected with smallpox. So these guys said, no, we're not doing that. And so they went away. And in fact, as far as I can tell, they never did attack the owner of the ship, even when he came out of the smallpox hospital 3 or 4 weeks later, after he had been inoculated and was now immune. I don't know whether that was just a total coincidence that he was in the smallpox hospital at the time he was about to be attacked by the locals. But in any event, it was an extremely fortunate thing for him that he was in the smallpox hospital then, because it prevented him from being attacked. Okay, so remember, one chest of tea was divided among the workers. Then there were 2 other chests, and the residents divided into 3 factions. The residents of the Cape divided into 3 factions. Men and women who would sell or purchase any tea, those who would sell, earn, or purchase EICT from the wreck on which no duty had been paid, and those who opposed the buying and selling of all tea, whether or not it had been taxed or not. Smuggled tea was not involved on the Cape. This was only EIC legal tea. So you have these different groups of Cape residents who begin then to struggle with each other over what to do with the contents of the tea chests. Now, initially, the disputes on the Cape centered on those workmen who had been paid in tea. Some of them, unsurprisingly, sold part of their shares to others, wanting to turn it into cash or to trade it with something else. I don't know how they did it. But in Truro, there were some of these workers were from Truro. In Truro, those who ended up with even small amounts of the company tea were brought before the town meeting, just like the Salem ship captain was, and they were forced to acknowledge their error at the town meeting. And during that town meeting, they adopted exactly the same excuse that the Salem captain did. They had acquired the tea, they said, through ignorance and inadvertence, exactly the same phrase. Now, as a part of all of this, an unnamed elderly gentleman, he was written about in the newspapers, from another town. I have no idea whether it was a town on the Cape or off the Cape or whatever, but he had been in Provincetown and he purchased 2 or 3 pounds of tea from one of the workers in Provincetown. And while en route home, back home to wherever he was going, he was accosted in the Wellfleet Woods by 3 men in disguise. They searched his saddlebags, they found the tea he had purchased, and they threw it out along the road. So he lost all of it. Now, near the end of January 1774, a group of disguised men, and could it have been the same men? I don't know, because I have no idea what the names of these guys were, reportedly searched every house in Provincetown looking for tea. And they confiscated whatever tea they found. Now, unless the laborers that Greeno had hired had managed to dispose of the tea they earned before then, they therefore subsequently had very little to show for their effort in salvaging the goods from the wreck. Now, another raid in Provincetown targeted a man named Stephen Atwood, who in early January of 1774 purchased one of the 2 remaining chests from John Greeno. Toward the end of the month of January, several local incendiaries, that's a phrase that Greeno used, confronted Atwood. They searched his house. They found a large quantity of tea in the house and they burned it publicly. Now, the raiders might not have located all that Atwood had acquired, though, because by then it had been in hands for several weeks, even a month, and he could already have sold part of it. And some months later, a peddler from Martha's Vineyard turned up in Lyme, Connecticut with about 100 pounds of tea to sell. People in Lyme, Connecticut concluded that it had probably come from the wreck of the William. And the chest that Greeno turned over to Atwood, which would have had about 300 pounds of tea in it, does indeed seem to have been a likely source for such a large amount of tea. How would a peddler from the vineyard have ended up with 100 pounds of tea if he hadn't gotten it from the wreck of the William and through Atwood? So that's one possibility at least, and it brings the vineyard into the story. Now that left one damaged tea chest in the custody of John Greeno, and that chest ended up causing even more trouble than the other 2. When John was still in Provincetown, his brother David wrote from Wellfleet and sent it on a special messenger. It's great that this letter actually survives. His brother David wrote from Wellfleet begging John to have nothing to do with the tea. He did not want it reported, he said, quote, that a brother of mine, a son of our honorable father, ever bought or sold any of the detestable stuff, end quote. John's neighbors in Wellfleet, David said, had threatened to destroy not only the tea, but also John's house and his other property. And John was a merchant, so he had a store too. David said, your neighbors will destroy your stuff if you bring the tea here. But if that happened, David said, nobody will pity you. And he predicted, he signed, and I love how he signed this letter. He signed, your loving brother if you don't concern with any tea, end quote. That's how he signed the letter. But John Greeno ignored this well-intentioned warning. he sold somewhat more than half of the good tea in the remaining chest of Bohea, about something over 100 pounds, maybe 150 pounds, to Colonel Willard Knowles, who was one of the leading residents of Eastham. Now, at this time, Wellfleet was a district within Eastham, but the two areas operated pretty much independently. Knowles then started to market the tea, and that set off confrontations in both Eastham and Wellfleet between supporters and opponents of these two elite men, of John Greeno and Willard Knowles. Now, one I think is one of the most interesting things that happened is that the presence of the EICT in Eastham led to competing town meetings and later to standoffs between angry crowds and the local militia. The first town meeting in Eastham occurred on January 21st, 1774. At that time, the town meeting voted to allow Knowles to continue to sell the tea. It had not paid any tax, so why shouldn't he be able to sell it? And they expressed no concern about the sale of the tea. But at the second meeting, a month later, a different conclusion was reached. And in February, the meeting was a different meeting. It was not restricted to qualified voters. The meeting in January was only for qualified voters. The meeting in February was opened up to all male residents. And at that meeting, when wealthier men regarded the meeting as irregular and didn't attend, at that meeting, those present excoriated Knowles for buying and selling the tea that had been obtained from Greeno, and they deliberately insulted him. You remember, he was a colonel, he was the leader of the militia, by ordering the selectmen to return or to remove the town's supply of ammunition from his custody. That's a terrible insult, telling the leader of the local militia that he can't be trusted with ammunition, with the town's ammunition supply. Now, when the selectmen refused to do that, that is, refused to take the ammunition and the guns away from Knowles, in early March, a disguised crowd threatened one of the selectmen with tarring and feathering, but they desisted after he announced that he recognized some of them, which meant that they might be arrested. And so that was the end of that. On two later occasions, crowds gathered again to try to attack Knowles himself, but the local militia mustered to defend him, and the attackers reluctantly ended their campaign. So they quit attacking Knowles, finally. In late March, at a third town meeting, Eastham townsmen formally reversed the February vote, declaring that its criticisms of Knowles were, quote, false and scandalous and defamatory. So this is again a meeting only open to qualified voters. They insisted that meetings like the one in February would, quote, never have the tendency to restore the liberties of America. Furthermore, they resolved that the buying and selling of untaxed tea should not be interpreted as endorsing the Tea Act or the right of Parliament to tax America. They publicly defended the honor and character of Colonel Knowles. And one of my favorite things of this whole story is that the town meeting of Eastham then ordered the town clerk to, quote, erase, deface, obliterate, and blot out, end quote. They wanted to be known, really sure what was happening. Erase, deface, obliterate, and blot out the record of the February meeting. They didn't want Knowles to go down as someone who had been excoriated by the town. And so, having for a second time formally approved the sales of the tea, the residents of Eastham presumably continued to purchase the salvaged and non-duty paying tea from Willard Knowles. Now, how about John Greeno? Well, he did not have to deal with mobs the way that Knowles did, but he did have to defend himself verbally against his fellow townsmen. In a formal statement to the other residents of Wellfleet that he drafted in late January, he defended his sale of untaxed EICT and criticized the ruffians, that's his word, who had raided the houses in Provincetown, terming them, quote, plunderers and assassins. Their actions were, quote, as destructive to society as the most cruel tyranny. And he argued if such men gained power, the people of Massachusetts would be worse off than under the current regime. And this is, by the way, the kind of argument that's made frequently in this period by people who oppose what was going on with what they regarded as mob rule. They said it's worse rule by them, worse tyranny being ruled by them than being ruled by the British. Now, Wellfleet men then voted to place the tea remaining in Greeno's hands, probably about 100 pounds, into the custody of the local committee. Well, they sought advice from Boston. They couldn't decide what to do. And so they wrote to the committee in Boston on the 25th of January to inquire whether tea could be sold in Wellfleet from the damaged tea chest. Then they had to wait for 2 months for an answer. Boston did not rush to answer to the questions from Wellfleet. And so when the answer came, the Bostonians shifted the responsibility right back to the Cape. They told the inquirers to, quote, rely on your own good sense. So they basically told the people in Wellfleet, we're not going to tell you what to do, you just decide yourself. And so they did the same thing as Eastham did. They allowed Greeno to market the tea, which he proceeded to do despite some persistent opposition from those he termed, quote, factious persons. We don't know exactly what that opposition was, but maybe they were, I don't know, picketing outside his store or something. And he sold all the tea by early May. Now, from this story of what happened in the Cape, on the Cape, where all you guys are so familiar with it, two key conclusions, I think, can be drawn. First, and most obviously, the colonists loved tea, and they were eager to acquire it cheaply. When hundreds of pounds of untaxed tea unexpectedly washed up on their shores, many residents of the Cape proved willing to work to earn it, to purchase it in large or small quantities, and to adopt formal resolutions contending that buying or selling unduty tea was a politically neutral activity. Although there were, quote, Cape Indians, as they were called, such as those in Eastham who took a more hardline stance against the purchasers of EICT, they were outnumbered by the Cape Cod residents who were reluctant to give up their favorite beverage. Now, the second point I want to make is the pervasive dissension. Although residents of the Boston area might have been more or less unanimous in wanting to oppose the tea, this was not true even in all Massachusetts towns, and in the book I show it's not true in all other colonies. The debates in Charleston revealed wide-ranging disagreements, and both New York and Philadelphia chose to exclude the tea ships, at least in part because their arrival would have caused problems, just like they were causing on the Cape and in Charleston. The sorts of conflicts that could arise over tea were vividly illustrated on Cape Cod. Ordinary laborers and sailors were divided between those who would assist in landing or transporting the tea and those who would not. In Provincetown, men in disguise raided their neighbors' houses and attacked travelers on the road, seeking and destroying tea. Eastham residents engaged in competing town meetings, angry crowds, challenged the selectmen and challenged Colonel Knowles, who was the leader of the militia. He was the most elite guy in Eastham, and that was to the dismay of many people. John Greeno's family was divided. Remember, his brother told him not to do it, and by the way, his father in Boston also told him not to do it, which I haven't talked about tonight. And Greeno found these circumstances very chaotic and unsettling. Surely other people on the Cape found him the same way. Were towns on the Cape to be ruled by men that Greeno called Indian Liberty Sons, and by a government he termed, quote, the Indian Constitution? That was the question. And by that, of course, he meant really a lack of government. Moreover, the ultimate resolution of the disputes in both Eastham and Wellfleet, allowing the sale of undutied EICT from the wreck of the William, was certainly not a satisfactory outcome from the standpoint of the colonial opponents of the Tea Act. No wonder far-sighted Americans did not want the tea landed. Correctly predicting the possible divisive consequences, they chose the most effective course of action, the one recommended in October by Dr. Benjamin Rush. That is, preventing the tea from landing in the first place. And so I'm going to end this talk there with acknowledging the wisdom of the opponents of the tea in the colonies. And I'm happy to answer any questions. I just need a glass of water for it.
Thank you, Dr. Norton. That was great. if you got any questions, and a couple of you have already typed it in, remember to type something in the chat feature down below, and we'll use that. Got a couple things right out of the chute. You had mentioned about the Boston Port Act
Mhm.
and how this was essentially protests against lower taxes, which I find mind-numbing. Like,
Yes, that's great.
explain the Boston Port Act again, and how
Okay.
is this being viewed by back in England and by other people, that there's protests against lower taxes, which I think all of us would probably have a tough time wrapping our head around.
Right. Well, remember what the Americans were protesting were the symbolism of the tax. And what the British were insisting on was the symbolism of the tax. That is, they were insisting that Parliament should be enabled to tax America. The Americans were saying, no, Parliament cannot tax America. So the argument was over the tax itself. Even if it was lower, it was still a tax, and that's why the Americans were protesting it. So that's that point. Now, the Boston Port Act, I don't know if that answers your question. You can ask me for more information if you want. The Boston Port Act provided that the Port of Boston would be closed to all traffic other than local traffic in food and fuel until the tea was paid for. And Boston was, of course, a major port, had major shipbuilding industries, and was very important in the Caribbean trade at the time. And so it really destroyed the economy. The point of the Boston Port Act was to destroy the economy of Boston, which it did as long as the British were there. And of course, the British ultimately evacuated Boston in March of 1776. And from that point on, Boston was able to function again. But as long as the Boston Port Act was in effect and enforced by the British Navy, which was in force in the Boston Harbor, all traffic, actually, the British were basically forcing all traffic to come overland from Salem. So ships coming from overseas would have to go into Salem, enter the customs house there, pay their duty there, and then any goods that they had that were being shipped to Boston had to be carried overland. Things could come by land to Boston. For example, people from Connecticut, because they were trying to help Boston in this time of trouble, people from Connecticut donated flocks of sheep, which were then driven overland to Boston and so forth. But basically, Boston, the idea of the Port Act was to cut off Boston from everything but its hinterland, and cut off all trade, basically kill all Boston commerce until the tea was paid for, as a punishment for the destruction of the tea.
Okay, how much was a chest of tea worth?
Well, I haven't figured the amount of a particular chest, but the pound, even a pound, but the tea sold for about East India Company tea sold for several shillings a pound, sold for about about 7 shillings a pound, and smuggled tea sold for about 3 shillings a pound. So you figure it out. And it also depended on how good the tea was. The tea that we're talking about here, the tea that was on the Cape, was the basic black tea, Bohea tea. There was nicer tea that was worth more money. And nicer tea tended to be shipped in chests of only 70 pounds. This ordinary tea was shipped in chests of 350 pounds. But it was basically, in today's money, the Bostonians threw hundreds of thousands of dollars of tea into the harbor. They threw 342 chests of tea into the harbor, and most of those were 350-pound chests of tea. So hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Okay. You talked about a qualified member. What does that mean, being a qualified
voter? It meant that the person met the property qualifications for voting in the colony of Massachusetts, and that meant you had to be a man. You had to own a certain amount of property, and I cannot tell you what that amount of property was in the towns on the Cape. there was a minimal, you could not vote unless you were, in other words, a man of substance. You couldn't vote if you were a young guy. It was not a vote based on age. It was a vote based on you being regarded as a man of substance in the community. So you had to have a freehold of a particular assessed value based on the last tax assessment to be a qualified voter.
Okay. With the destruction of the tea, how does this impact smugglers? Does smuggled tea rise in price? And
well, it's hard to know what happened in Boston. Boston seems to have actually, crazily enough, Boston seems to have been more likely to buy EICT than smuggled tea before all this happened. Philadelphia and New York, we know, had very little legitimate importations of EICT in the years before 1773. It's been estimated that those cities were both drinking well over 150,000 pounds of tea a year. Everybody drank tea. It's kind of like coffee today. It's definitely like coffee today. That people were drinking so much smuggled tea, but in New York and Philadelphia, only a couple of hundred only a couple of hundred pounds of tea got officially entered into the customs system and paid duty on. So basically, hundreds of thousands of pounds of smuggled tea were being sold in the colonies. In Boston, it's really hard to know, but clearly there was smuggled tea out there. There was plenty of it. I have not studied this, but a man I know who teaches at the University of Hong Kong, James Fichter, people really interested in this topic. He's doing a book specifically on the tea trade. And he has done things like read all the newspapers of this period looking for ads for tea to be sold. And so he knows how many merchants there were selling the tea. Now, we don't know how many pounds of tea each of those merchants were selling, but he knows that there were tens of merchants in every community selling tea. And most of that tea would have been smuggled. So it's so hard to find out how much the cost of the smuggled tea was. It just isn't anything. So anyway, it's just impossible to know. It's impossible to know.
If you're part of the great unwashed, like, I don't know, me, who doesn't
Right.
drink tea, EICT, what is one more bitter than the other?
Well, there was a big argument about which tea was better. I mean, some people said that EICT was better than the Dutch tea, and other people said, no, the Dutch tea was better. I mean, who knows? As I said, the EIC had a whole variety of grades of tea. And so sometimes they sent better tea to America, and sometimes they sent worse tea to America. And it was it's all a matter of taste and substance, whether you like the taste of this tea or that tea. And people did argue over whether the Dutch tea, the smuggled tea, was better than the English tea, regardless of whether it was smuggled or not. So we cannot really judge what's better at this distance. We just know that everybody drank tea, and lots of it.
Of the towns you mentioned on the Cape, those are lower Cape towns, what are we talking about in population at that time?
They're in the hundreds.
All right. I know your book basically, you start with the tea. You kind of leads into Lexington and Concord. Tell us a little bit more about the
whole book is what I do is I trace what happens throughout the year. As news passes from one place to another, I follow the stories in the newspapers and see how different towns react, or different cities and different areas, not all towns and cities. So, for example, the Virginia countryside react to the news about what's going on in the other places, how Boston reacts to Charleston, how Charleston reacts to Boston, and so forth. And I deal with how the colonies in general dealt with dealt with the fact that the British were being very recalcitrant. That is, there were a number of Americans who kept wanting the British to adopt conciliatory policies, and instead the British kept adopting harder line policies, which ultimately forced a lot of Americans who were originally in favor of reconciliation to support resistance. And what I talk about in the book is what happens throughout the year, as, for example, throughout the summer of 1774, in the wake of the Boston Port Act, in the wake of the other coercive acts, which are also adopted by Parliament in the spring of 74, how people react to those. And let me just give you one example. An act that does not get a lot of attention, it's called the Administration of Justice Act, officially. And what it provided in sum was that if a British colonial official or military officer was charged with killing an American in a disturbance, that person could be tried in England rather than in America. So if it had been operative in 1770, it would have moved the Boston Massacre trial out of Boston and to London. The Americans called that the Murder Act, which to me is very telling. And even future loyalists were very distressed by this law, because they said, this means we have no way of striking back against a vicious military man or colonial official who shoots people or who rapes our wives, because these are all men who say this, or who rapes our wives and daughters. We have no way of trying them for their crime. So that aroused a lot of opposition. And throughout the colonies in the summer of 1774, the colonists held local meetings, and I talk about those at some detail. We don't really know what happened at them, but they did adopt resolutions. And we don't know the minutes of those meetings, but we do know that they adopted resolutions. And the resolutions basically supported Boston, offered financial support to Boston, did not always support, in fact, did not usually support the Boston's destruction of the tea, but they supported the Boston against the strictures of the Port Act, and they elected representatives to the First Continental Congress, which then met in Philadelphia in September and October of 1774 and plotted a unified resistance to Britain. That's basically what the book is about. How that happened. The book is a study of political discourse, I say. It's the way that Americans in correspondence, pamphlets, and newspapers talked about the political crises they found themselves in.
Right. Well, I want to thank you very much for joining us tonight and spending some time. Even though you're not too far away in the vineyard, I think everyone's a little bit far away right these days. So thank you very much for joining us. Thank you for touching on a local history, even though it's part of a broader national history. I want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. I want to thank you, Dr. Norton. Our next talk is on Thursday night. So again, good luck with this book, and thanks for joining us.
Go out and buy the book and find out the rest of the story.
All right. Stay safe, everybody. Thank you.